My heart raced in my chest as the door slammed shut. Heavy footsteps echoed through the house and I froze. He wasn't supposed to be home for at least 5 more hours. I had barely enough time. The blood drained from my face as I stood motionless, unable to breathe. And then I saw him. Standing there in the doorway. Him. The one who wasn't supposed to be here. Not now. Not like this. His gaze swept over the room, taking in everything with a cold, calculating look. There was no need for words. Everything was clear. His eyes met mine. The silence between us was suffocating, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. Time felt frozen, the air thick with the realization of what was happening. I knew something was wrong, but I never thought you were capable of this, he said, his voice low and steady but full of anger and disbelief. I stood there, completely still, unable to form a response. I wanted to scream, to explain, to make it all go away, but nothing came out. My mind raced, heart pounding in my ears as I tried to catch my breath. And then he took a step closer. I knew in that moment it was over. We cut to a few days earlier, before everything unraveled. He walked toward me in the hallway, already dressed in his business suit, a briefcase in one hand, his other gripping a suitcase that wasn't packed for a weekend getaway but for a work trip. My stomach dropped. "I'm sorry, I can't go. Last-minute business trip," he said, his words almost detached. I stared at him, disbelief flooding my chest. "You promised. We've been planning this weekend for months." I felt the words rise up like bile, but they caught in my throat. His gaze flickered away like he couldn't even meet my eyes. "You know how important this is," he muttered, as if that somehow made it better. And there it was again, the familiar sting of disappointment, the quiet knot in my stomach. I swallowed it down like I always did, pretending it didn't hurt. Just then I heard footsteps on the stairs and his son appeared, coming down with his phone in hand, eyes glued to the screen. "Guess the trip's off, huh?" he said, flipping through his phone with no emotion. My husband tossed his keys onto the shelf. "Yeah, but it's fine. You're not upset, are you? You can spend the weekend with your stepmom," he said, smirking as he walked out. It wasn't a joke. The car was silent, the kind of silence that settled in your chest and made it hard to breathe. I tried to break it, forcing out casual questions, but he answered with one-word replies as if he couldn't be bothered. "If you don't want to go with me, just say it," I blurted out, my frustration bubbling over. He glanced at me, his face unreadable. "I don't care," he muttered. The road stretched out ahead, empty like everything else between us. Later in the hotel room I stepped out of the shower, my hair still damp, feeling the cold bite of the air. He was sitting on the bed, staring at the TV with the muted news playing in the background. The only light in the room came from a dim lamp, casting shadows across his face. "I'm going for a walk. You coming?" I asked, unsure why I even bothered. He shrugged, uninterested. "Sure." Outside, the night air bit into me as we walked in silence. The city lights reflected in the puddles beneath our feet. We stopped at the overlook, the ocean stretching out dark and endless. "Do you miss him?" he suddenly asked, breaking the quiet. "Who?" "Your dad." I laughed nervously, but it was hollow. "What a stupid question. You look like you're missing someone who's really here with you." The words hit harder than I expected. I turned away, but I felt his gaze, sharp and unsettling. "Stop," I whispered. But he didn't move. I couldn't stop myself, though. Before I knew it, I was leaning in, his breath warm on my skin. The kiss lasted only a moment, but it felt like everything changed. I pulled away quickly. "No, this is wrong." He nodded, and in his eyes there was no regret, only understanding. The next morning we moved through the motions like nothing had happened. He acted like he always did, distant, focused on his phone, pretending nothing had shifted between us. I tried to follow his lead, keeping my eyes down, pretending the heavy weight in the air didn't exist. But every time I caught his gaze, something in me twisted. It was there, in the way he looked at me just a little longer than necessary, and in the way my breath hitched when I was close to him. The silence between us was suffocating. I tried to ignore the way my heart raced when our hands brushed as we passed each other, how his presence seemed to linger in the space between us. It was all wrong, but the pull was undeniable. We drove home in the same silence, the hum of the road beneath us the only sound. I couldn't bring myself to say anything, and neither could he. I wanted to forget everything, pretend it had never happened, but the more I tried, the harder it became to ignore what was between us. It felt like everything had changed and yet nothing was different at all. That evening my husband came home earlier than expected, his presence filling the room in an instant. "How was your weekend?" he asked, his voice casual, but there was something in his eyes I couldn't read. I forced a smile, my heart not in it. "Good," I replied, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. He didn't seem to notice. Instead he walked closer, his hand gently brushing against my waist, pulling me a bit toward him. "I missed you," he murmured, his breath warm against my neck. The words were so familiar, so comforting, but they didn't land the way they once did. As he leaned in to kiss me, I could feel his lips on mine, but it was as if I wasn't even there. The kiss wasn't new or passionate. It was just a gesture, a routine, something we both knew we were supposed to do. But all I could think about was the other kiss, the one I could never forget. I pulled back just slightly, realizing in that instant that everything had changed. I knew deep down my marriage was over. But somehow I still hadn't realized that it was already too late. Later that night, as I climbed the stairs, I caught a glimpse of his figure standing in the shadows at the top. He was there. The whole time. Watching. It hit me like a wave. He knew everything. The air felt thick, suffocating as I stood frozen in place, trying to process what was happening. He didn't move, his eyes locked on mine with an unsettling calmness. In those eyes there was no anger, no rage, just emptiness. It was worse than anything I had expected. The silence between us stretched out as if the world had stopped turning. "Now I understand why you pulled away so quickly that night," he said, his voice low, but there was no emotion behind it, just a cold truth. My mind raced, but no words came. I wanted to explain, to apologize, to say anything to fix it, but the words wouldn't form. He didn't wait for me to speak. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, drowning in the weight of everything unspoken. He avoids me now like I'm a ghost in the house. No glances, no words, not even the faintest hint of acknowledgement. It's as if I've become invisible, a stranger he no longer wants to deal with. The silence between us grows heavier with each passing day, suffocating any attempt I make to bridge the distance. I try to speak, to reach out, but nothing works. His eyes remain distant, his movements mechanical. He's a man I no longer recognize, and I'm the one who broke him. And it hits me hard, the realization that I've lost him, not just as my husband but as the person who once shared everything with me. The man who trusted me, who let me into his life, his thoughts, his heart. That man is gone, replaced by someone who looks at me as if I'm the last person he wants to see. I can't fix this. There's no apology big enough, no excuse to make it right. I've torn everything apart and now I'm left alone in the wreckage, knowing that there's no going back. It's over. The evening was quiet, like the calm before a storm. My husband had left earlier, the house empty except for the soft hum of the appliances and the lingering tension in the air. I had been feeling tense all day, my muscles tight from stress, and after a long day at work, I decided to ask my son for a quick massage, something we often did to help each other relax. He sat behind me, his hands pressing firmly against my shoulders, working down my back. The pressure was just right, and I felt the weight of the day start to lift as his hands moved with practiced ease, focusing on the tight spots that needed the most attention. I allowed my son to massage me, grateful for the comfort he was providing, not thinking anything of it. His touch was soothing, a calming presence in the midst of all the chaos in my mind. I closed my eyes, lost in the motion, letting myself unwind just for a moment. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway. My heart skipped a beat, my body going stiff. I walked into the room where he stood by the window staring out. "We need to talk," he said, his voice cold. He shook his head slowly. "No, it's already clear." I took a step forward, desperate for some kind of explanation. "Just tell me it was a mistake and I'll go away." But the silence was deafening. I reached out to touch his hand, but before I could, the door slammed open. My husband was standing there, his eyes piercing, his presence overwhelming. He understood everything and there were no words needed. His eyes, cold and empty, spoke volumes as they swept over us, taking in the scene, the truth of everything that had been left unsaid. The silence between us was suffocating, thick with the weight of the realization, the finality of it all. The air felt heavy as if the room itself was holding its breath. And then, without warning, the sound of keys clattering against the floor broke through the stillness. The sharp noise echoed through the house, the sound of his trust shattering. He didn't need to say anything more. His actions spoke louder than any words could. "Leave. Both of you," he said, his voice low, but with a finality that sent a chill down my spine. There was no question, no room for negotiation. It was over. The man who once shared everything with me, the one I thought I knew, had vanished. The reality of what I had done, what I had lost, hit me like a wave. I didn't move, couldn't move as the world around me crumbled. This was the end. He left first, his suitcase in hand, moving through the house as if it were just another day. There was no confrontation, no tearful goodbyes, just the soft click of the door closing behind him. I heard his car pull away, the sound of his departure echoing in the emptiness that followed. Soon after, the papers arrived. My husband had filed for divorce. Just like that, the life we had built together was reduced to signatures on a piece of paper. I stayed in the house, trapped in the silence, feeling more alone than I had ever been. The walls seemed to close in on me, pressing against my chest with the weight of all the things left unsaid. I spent the days numb, going through the motions, but everything felt hollow. Then one evening, standing in front of the mirror, I caught my reflection. But the woman staring back at me wasn't the one I had known. She was someone else, someone broken, someone who had lost everything. I didn't recognize her. I didn't know who I was anymore. The void inside me deepened, and I realized with a sinking heart, there was no going back.